I also talked to some of your friends, the first one being Carl Kasell.
Oh, yeah.
He says, one of the main things you have in common is your interest in W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the greatest American thinkers about educational opportunity, civil rights, and diversity. You knew W.E.B. Du Bois personally.
Yes, I had met Du Bois when I was in college, but wasn't smart enough then to recognize really who he was. He was simply a great man. But when we moved to New York, the first full-time job I had was that of psychologist in the Department of Pediatrics down at the Jewish Hospital in Brooklyn. And my chief of psychiatry was a chap named Joseph Werthers, who lived in Brooklyn Heights, and next door to him lived Shirley and W.E.B. Du Bois. And Dr. Werthers invited Susan and me over to have supper with them one night. And Du Bois and I struck off a strong relationship that lasted until '58 when he left for Ghana.
Sure.
I consider him at least one of my major mentors, if not the most important. And the debate has to do less with the intensity of the relationship than what I took from it. And I think while there were very important influences on my intellectual development, Du Bois was probably the greatest.
What did you take from it? How did he inspire you, who you are today?
I have a paper in which I titled it Learning to Think Like Du Bois, and I don't make this point in that paper, but in response to your question, I think I really learned to be a thinker in my interactions with him. I recall that up until that time, up until I met Du Bois, I was preoccupied with two concerns. One was trying to learn as much information as I could, and the other one was trying to understand the mechanisms by which you explain things. Under Du Bois' influence, I continued my respect for kind of encyclopedic mastery of knowledge, which he tended to model, but I began to attach less importance to it, even though I still tried to know everything I could. But the thing that really began to consume my interest was trying to decipher the meanings of the things I knew, the meanings of the things I experienced. Because if you were talking to Du Bois or reading him or listening to his lecture, he always anchored his presentations in a solid knowledge base, but he went on to try to figure out now, what does this mean? And what would it mean if circumstances were different? What does it mean when you look at it from a perspective different from the person who has presented it? What was the knowledge interests of that person? And what if those knowledge interests had been different? Would that have changed the way in which the conclusions were formulated? And that approach to thinking has stayed with me and served me quite well. And I have to attribute that to W.E.B.
You also reference the talented 10th in some of your pieces.
Oh, yes.
What do you take from that?
Du Bois was simply arguing there that in any population, if the ablest people in that population are not nurtured, the population is limited. And my work toward the end of the 20th century on the achievement gap, and especially the work on the underproductivity of middle-class black people was greatly influenced by that set of notions. One that all populations, excuse me for a second, all populations tend to get their leadership from the ablest members of the population. And if the population neglects that group, it weakens itself. And the data I was working with beginning in about 1963 or 4 increasingly indicated not only was there a gap in the achievement levels of black and white populations, but if you looked at the black middle class, the gap was larger for middle-class blacks than for lower-class blacks if you compared them to their peers. That meant that the black middle class was underproducing despite its privileges. And Dubois was talking and writing just about that in his commitment to racial uplift, the uplift of black people, he felt that special attention needed to be given to the best developed of those if the race as a group were to be uplifted. Then he argued, he had a moral argument in it. He said there was a responsibility for those that we lift and enable to achieve even more. There's a responsibility for them to uplift the entire group.
I also talked to Ernest Washington.
Oh, yeah.
He sees in you a kind of sweet irony in which you see the contradictions, but you do not hold it against us. What do you think he means by that?
I think when he's talking about the fact that I tend to be critical, I tend to recognize the paradoxes, the contradictions that exist in almost everything, and of course in all people. But I'm not condemnatory. I don't put you down for it. I try to better understand it, help you better understand it, and do something about it, rather than just being critical of it.
Your former student, Eleanor Armour Thomas, says your most significant accomplishment was your interactionist perspective to account for the relationship between human diversity, learning, and behavior. It was from this conceptual lens that you provided a new direction for research, teaching, and assessment of populations from diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, she's very kind to give me credit for it. I'm not sure quite where I got that set of notions. I think I was first introduced to it in my relationship with two friends, Alexander Thomas and Stella Chess. They were psychiatrists, friends I got to meet in my Harriet Tubman Clinic days. But I think it was Alex and our mutual friend Herbert Birch, when we were struggling with problems of the genetic bases for intelligence and racial differences. Alex and Herb introduced me to the literature of interactionism, where the explanation for almost any phenomenon has to come out of the ways in which the features that are given in the person or in the organism interact with the features that are given in the environment. Eleanor was one of my students, and she was sensitive enough, I guess she couldn't have missed it, to recognize that as a centerpiece in my thinking, and she attributed it to me. But it is not original with me. But it does capture an approach to knowledge and knowledge production that is ubiquitous in my thinking. Almost anything I'm trying to explain, I look not for either or answers, but for the answer that is provided by an examination of the interaction.
Mm-hmm. Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Are you familiar with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I use that a lot in terms of research
yes.
methods as well.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Anna Marie Koss, another former student of yours. From when you were at Yale, she says you have most inspired her with your work on the defiers of negative prediction. What are the defiers of negative prediction?
That was a line of research in which I was looking at people who were predicted to fail, against whom the odds were stacked.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was trying to do was to account for their success against the odds.
Mm.
I pursued that work for, I guess almost 10 years, and it still influences some of my thinking. But I backed away from it because I progressively became aware of the fact that there were not good answers to the problem of uplift for masses of people, because in those defiers you had the exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
I finally realized one day that for each of the persons I had found who succeeded, there were tens of thousands who had not. And that led me to ask the question of what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to the conclusion that the society is really organized to produce winners, not to produce losers.
Mm.
And if one really wants to do something to uplift large numbers of people, you've got to do something about the society that's organized to defeat them, rather than what a few of us are able to do to overcome it.
What are the implications of that for schools?
Well, it's almost as if I planted that question, because it takes us to
I walked right into it.
my current preoccupation. I'm a very strong critic of Mr. Obama and Arne Duncan's emphasis on school reform, because I don't think school reform is going to solve the problem they're trying to work on.
Mm-hmm.
There are several problems that contribute to the underproductivity of our society in educating people. One of them, we have not been able or willing to seriously engage the finding that indicates the very high correlation between adequacy of resources and school achievement. Mm-hmm. The best predictor we've got: if you're rich in this country, you're likely to be educated, and if you're poor, you're likely to be uneducated.
And you don't need the test score to tell you that.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So that the very first thing we ought to do is do something about more equally distributing access to the forms of education-relevant capital that intellective development seems to rest on. Mm. The society isn't willing to do that. Mm-hmm. We do need good schools, and I don't object to heavy investment in schooling and heavy investment in the improvement of it. But I think even if we had the very best schools, if we didn't do something about the underlying problem that's contributing so heavily to the lack of success of schools, the schools aren't gonna fix it. Mm. Number 3, I think that we know the relationship between out-of-school learning experiences and school achievement. Mm-hmm. Howard Everson down at the College Board some years ago was looking at SAT scores, and sure enough, those kids who had the richest out-of-school learning experiences had the highest SAT scores. Now, their good school experience helped, but it seemed that these things that were happening in the rest of their lives were terribly important. And of course, Dewey had made this point back in 1920, Larry Kremen reinforced it in the 70s. And it's behind what I call supplementary or comprehensive education. That's looking at the complementarities between the learning and teaching that occur outside of school, and of course the teaching and learning that occur inside of school. You need both, but if you're only going to attend to one, you're likely to be in trouble. And I'm persuaded that if I had to choose between the two, I think I would throw my weight behind the stuff that happens outside of school. Because it is in those out-of-school learning experiences, which are certainly more ubiquitous to the lives of kids, it is in those that kids tend to develop or fail to develop a sense of power, a sense of agency. And I've long been convinced, and Coleman's data seem to indicate it, that where there's a sense of power, where there's a sense of agency, the capacity to act in my own behalf, one finds ways to deal with the odds against learning, or to extract from opportunities to learn the best. So all of those have led me to try to work on the conditions of life, the diverse opportunities for learning, as opposed to the narrow opportunities for learning that we have in school.
And you continue to work, which leads me right into the next question. I talked to Wade Boykin, and he says he most respects in you that you continue to be on the cutting edge of educational research, even after an approximately 60-year career. What do you see as the #1 cutting issue currently facing education?
I suppose if Mr. Obama had consulted me on his education program, I would have given the same speech I just gave, that we've got to do something, we've got to do more to strengthen the capacities of families and communities to support the education of kids, to support what I call the intellective development of kids. If we're going to seriously engage the problems of education. But there are a lot of things that can be done within the field of education, since one implication of my argument is that the problem isn't primarily pedagogical, it's political economic. Within education itself, I think I would begin with assessment. I think I would want to change assessment so that it is less concerned with the measurement of status and less used in accountability, and much more actively used to inform intervention. Many years ago, I had the good fortune of working with a woman who was a special educator. She worked with cerebrally damaged kids. Elsa Horseman was her name. And Elsa went to her death trying to standardize a test that she had developed that was much more concerned with documenting the processes by which kids achieved or failed, learned or failed to learn, and using that to inform her treatment of these kids, her interventions with these kids. And Elsa, having been influenced by traditional approaches to assessment, wanted to standardize this. And I remember arguing evening after evening with her that standardization would defeat what she's trying to do, because she's not trying to see what kids can do under standard circumstances, standard conditions. She's trying to figure out what kids need in order to learn the stuff. And I think that's the problem in assessment still. we need to be able to help teachers and other persons who intervene with kids, even the kids themselves. We need to help them better understand what it is that has to happen in their interaction with the learning opportunity to enable them to learn it. Because we don't all learn the same way at the same rate, so it's got to be fine-tuned for people. Our assessment ought to inform that process. And if it did, I think the intervention, the pedagogy would improve. And I'd like to see that assessment procedure embedded in the teaching and learning itself, rather than separating kids to subject them to on-demand performances as a way of testing. I would like in our interaction, as you teach me or I learn from you, if there's a rich record of that, we psychometricians then ought to be able to go to those records and deconstruct those records to take out our status data or our accountability data, management stuff. The primary function of assessment ought to be to help us learn how to teach better and to learn better.
On a similar note, William Trent says, you repeat work from your past. You refuse to repeat work from your past. You go further and integrate, synthesize, and evolve your work. What's next in terms of your scholarship?
I don't know, and I'm not optimistic that there will be much. Next June, I'm going to be 90. However, I've been expecting to die since I was about 60. My father died at 58, and I was sure, since I'm so much like him, that I'd be gone by then. So I never expected to get this far. I started to say doubt that I will be around that much longer, but I have to question that now, because there's probably no reason that I shouldn't make it to 90. So we've got to think about what I will do next. Although, I suppose it's okay for me to announce this. I was in a meeting down at the Education Testing Service last week, and the president announced that they are about to create a commission on the future of assessment. And are likely to be asked to chair it. So I suppose the problem I was just talking about is the thing I will next work on.
Congratulations.
Right. Oh, thank you.
You also were honored by ETS with the Edmund W. Gordon Chair for Policy Evaluation and Research.
Yeah, I've had